you gave a speech at the American Constitution Society at the University of Connecticut Law School in which you criticized mandatory minimums because empathy for individuals in a case inevitably comes into play, as it should. Does empathy factor in your decisions in a courtroom?
No.
You criticized mandatory minimums in that speech, and your following statement was empathy for individuals involved in a case inevitably comes into play, as it should.
And I think that it is important in a criminal case at sentencing for a judge to be conscious of the interests of all concerned.
Well, I'm a serial killer. I've killed 8 women, 6 in this state and 2 in New York. Serial killers like to strangle their victims, and that is, I guess, the most common form of killing because there's more of a connection there. It's more real, and it's not as quick.
Mr. Chatigny, this is the man you described in your testimony and in your discussions on this case as the least culpable of people on death row, and said, and I quote, he should never have been convicted, or if convicted, he never should have been sentenced to death.
I'm not a big serial killer, by the way. 8 people, that's nothing. I mean, there's a lot of other guys you can go see.
I was obliged to give careful consideration to the claim that he was not competent to waive legal challenges to this death sentence.
Most frightening thing about Michael Ross, other than his nondescript behavior, is that he told me, matter-of-factly, he said, Mike, if you hadn't caught me, I would have just kept on killing again.
Judge, this is serial murder. Is the man, you did everything possible to prevent the execution. I think the record shows that. You believed in your position. I just wonder why you think your behavior in this case, which is pretty extraordinary, I've only sat on this committee for 5 years, why that behavior would warrant a promotion to a much more senior court.
They got me on death row like that's supposed to be some big punishment.
Well, you said he should never have been convicted, and then went on to say, or if convicted, he never should have been sentenced to death because sexual sadism is clearly a mitigating factor, close quote. Can you cite any authority in which sexual sadism has been defined as a mitigating factor?
Maybe he was a sexual sadist, so what? That did not justify, number one, his doing what he did, and number two, it did not rise to the point of being a mitigating factor where they should render a verdict that called for other than the death penalty.
Was he not found out to be competent and ruled competent?
Ultimately, yes.
Judge, you have the authority on your own motion if contempt is executed in your presence to discipline lawyers, do you not?
Yes.
And lawyers know that, and they respect the power of a judge. And I have to say that your comments, really threats to Mr. Pauling, were inappropriate. Would you agree?
I would agree that the words I used were excessive, yes.
Told him that he was facilitating the execution of his client. These are direct quotations. That we are not in this profession to help people get killed. And third, and I tell you that, Mr. Pauling, because it is true. What you're doing is terribly, terribly wrong. And so I don't know how anybody in your position, honestly, Mr. Pauling, I do not know how anybody in your position could be accepting of this responsibility to proceed in the face of this record to be the proximate cause of this man's death. Do you remember those statements?
I do.
You then went on to warn him of the consequences of his not reversing course.
I apologize for using words that call into question my character as a judge in that case.
You, in this conference, cited your own personal experience in an unrelated matter touring the prison where Mr. Ross was held. And I gather this was not a part of the record in the case before you. Was that an appropriate thing?
In the ordinary case, a judge would not take into consideration things outside the record, but this was an emergency proceeding, and I felt I had an obligation to disclose that.
I'm worried about a standard that's outside the law and an empathy standard where you become too identified with a case to make a sound judgment. And matter of fact, multiple courts before yours had found him competent.
Biggest thrill sexually is from thoughts of actually strangling a woman. When I first came up here, I would relive the murders, the young girls that I killed. I would relive them multiple times a day, and I would masturbate to these thoughts to the point of actually having sores on myself. I used them, I degraded them. Leslie Shelley has always bothered me more than the others. I think it was because she was so small, I think it was because she was so cooperative, and I think it was because the way she was killed was so close to the fantasies. That was the one that was, it was like it was a fantasy. I raped her and I killed her. It wasn't pleasant. It wasn't a nice rape.
Again, I believe I did the right thing, but I went about it the wrong way, and for that, I'm sorry.